What if the guide you are looking for is, in fact, your greatest trap? Think about it. In your search for clarity, for a master, for a voice of wisdom that will finally bring order to your inner chaos, have you ever considered that you might be walking straight into an invisible prison? We have been taught to venerate the figure of the wise old man, the white-bearded mentor, the elder with deep eyes. But the unconscious is a territory of dualities, and every great light casts an equally vast shadow. The shadow of the sage archetype is not ignorance. It is something infinitely more dangerous. It is petrified wisdom. It is knowledge that has become dogma, truth that has become a weapon. It is the old tyrant, the guru who does not liberate his disciples, but makes them eternally dependent. It is the cynical intellectual who uses his brilliance to dissect life until it loses all its magic. It is the voice inside your own head that, under the guise of logic and experience, sabotages your intuition, ridicules your dreams, and keeps you chained to a sensible and lifeless reality. This shadow is the most subtle psychological trap that exists, because it cloaks itself in the garments of authority and reason. It convinces you that the map is more important than the territory, that ready-made answers are safer than soul-expanding questions. Before you know it, you are no longer on a journey of self-discovery, but in a gilded cage, built with the iron bars of the truths you accepted to protect yourself from the frightening mystery of living. What we will do next is not for the casually curious. We will dissect the 10 phases of this archetype's manifestation, from its brightest light to its most devouring shadow. This is not a journey for the superficial, but for those who feel, in the depths of their soul, that they are on the verge of an inevitable and terrifying transformation. Therefore, this is the moment of decision. If you are ready to dismantle your internal prisons and find the true, silent guide that dwells within you, make a pact now. Subscribe to this channel as an act of commitment to your own depth. Leave a like as a sign that you recognize the truth in these words and are ready to face what is to come. And most importantly, go to the comments and write "I accept the journey," not for me, but as a declaration to yourself, so that your psyche knows you are, at last, willing to listen. Once that is done, take a deep breath. The true immersion begins now. The archetypal image of the sage is, by its nature, seductive. It promises guidance, meaning, and a safe harbor in the midst of life's storms. However, the human psyche operates under the law of balance, in anhedromia, where everything, taken to an extreme, turns into its opposite. The relentless pursuit of wisdom, when driven by a fragile ego starved for validation, inevitably awakens its dark counterpart, the old tyrant. This is not an external figure, a fairy tale villain. It is a latent potential within each of us. It is the moment when the individual not only channels wisdom, but identifies with it. The psychic inflation is the genesis of tyranny. The I merges with the archetype and, instead of becoming a humble servant of the truth, comes to believe it is the truth itself. This archetypal possession is the root of all dogmatism. Knowledge, which should be a bridge to mystery, becomes a wall to protect oneself from it. The tyrant sage is terrified of "I don't know." Uncertainty is a mortal threat to his reign, as his power lies not in truth, but in the illusion of control that ready-made answers provide. He builds a castle of concepts, an intellectual fortress where he takes refuge from the chaotic and unpredictable flow of real life. From within his walls, he judges, condemns, and ridicules all who dare to live outside his definitions. He is the inner critic who says, "That's impossible," the skeptic who kills magic, the authoritarian father who demands blind obedience. In the outer world, he manifests as the cult leader who isolates his followers, the academic who despises any knowledge that cannot be measured and quantified, or the family patriarch whose experience serves only to invalidate the dreams and journeys of new generations. Recognizing this shadow is the first act of true wisdom. It requires a brutal honesty to ask oneself, am I using my knowledge to open doors, or to build cages for myself and for others? Liberation begins when we realize that the true sage does not fear doubt. He dances with it. The call never comes in a moment of triumph. It emerges from the cracked ground of a failure, from the deafening silence of a loss, or from the gray monotony of a life that is perfectly arranged but devoid of soul. Carl Jung called this process the second half of life, which is not defined by chronological age, but by a psychological turning point. It is the moment when the goals that once drove us professional success, social recognition, material security suddenly lose their luster. Achievement feels empty, and a dangerous question begins to echo in the back of the mind. Is this all there is? This is the cry of the soul. It is the psyche in its totality, rebelling against the tyranny of a one-sided ego that has built a perfectly functional, but existentially sterile life. Depression, anxiety, the midlife crisis often seen as pathologies to be medicated are, from a Jungian perspective, symptoms of an unanswered call. They are the fever of the soul, indicating that a vital part of us has been neglected and now demands attention. It is the pain of an unlived life becoming unbearable. In this existential desert, when all external sources of meaning have dried up, the psyche turns inward. The search for a guide is not a conscious decision. It is a survival mechanism of the soul. It is the implicit recognition that the maps provided by culture, family, and education are no longer useful for this new inner territory. Surrender is the portal. The encounter with the sage archetype is only possible when the ego, with all its arrogance and self-sufficiency, finally admits defeat. It is in the act of kneeling before the mystery of one's own life that help manifests, and it rarely comes in a spectacular fashion. The guide appears disguised as synchronicity, the book that accidentally falls off the shelf, the vivid dream that shatters the routine of sleep, a stranger's phrase that strikes at the core of your anguish. The sage speaks the language of symbols because this is the native tongue of the soul. The encounter, therefore, is not a single event, but the beginning of an ongoing dialogue with the depths, a process of learning to hear the whispers of the self amidst the noise of the world. Once the call has been answered, the sage begins to communicate, but his language is archaic, poetic, and disconcerting to the rational mind. He speaks through the nocturnal theater of dreams, the emotional resonance of a work of art, the inexplicable mistakes we make Freudian slips, and the sudden intuitions that emerge from silence. Deciphering these messages is like learning a forgotten language that, paradoxically, we have always known. The modern mind has been trained to value clarity, literality, and logic. The unconscious, however, operates through ambiguity, metaphor, and symbol. A symbol is not a mere sign where X means Y. A symbol is an image charged with psychic energy that points to something that cannot be fully expressed in words. It contains a multiplicity of meanings, many of them contradictory. For example, a snake in a dream can represent betrayal and danger, but also healing, renewal, the shedding of skin, and primordial wisdom. The sage forces us to abandon the binary thinking of right or wrong and to embrace the tension of opposites. To understand his language, one must suspend judgment and cultivate active imagination, a Jungian technique that involves entering into a conscious dialogue with the images that emerge from the unconscious. It is asking the dream figure, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" It is not about interpreting the dream from the outside with a dictionary of symbols, but about experiencing the image, feeling its emotional charge, and allowing it to reveal its meaning in its own time. The voice of the sage is subtle. It manifests as a feeling of certainty that has no logical basis, a shiver that confirms a truth, or a sense of coming home upon finding a place or a person. The rational mind, the inner tyrant sage, will try to discredit these experiences, labeling them as coincidence, sentimentality, or magical thinking. The task of the neophyte on the journey is to protect this nascent flame of intuition from the icy winds of cynicism. It is an act of courage to trust the compass of the heart when the logic of the brain points in the opposite direction. Learning to hear this voice is the essential training for individuation. The line separating enlightenment from ego inflation is as thin as a razor's edge. Contact with the numinous power of the archetypes is a transformative, but also dangerous, experience. The energy released can be overwhelming for an unprepared ego. Inflation occurs when the ego, instead of humbly relating to this energy, usurps it and claims it as its own. The individual no longer says, "I had a profound experience of unity," but rather, "I am enlightened." This small semantic shift reveals a psychological catastrophe. The inflated ego becomes rigid, brittle, and impervious to new information. It already knows, therefore. It has stopped learning. It is here that the wise old man turns into his dark caricature, the dogmatic preacher, the conspiracy theorist who holds the hidden truth, the pseudo-intellectual who quotes Jung or any other master without having embodied a single drop of their teachings. The manifestation of false wisdom can be identified by a few clear signs. First, a complete lack of humor. The inflated ego takes itself with mortal seriousness, as any joke could puncture its balloon of self-importance. Second, the inability to say I don't know or I was wrong. Admitting failure is impossible for one who identifies with the perfection of the archetype. Third, a compulsion to proselytize. True wisdom is quiet and content to simply be. False wisdom must constantly validate its existence by converting others. It does not offer, it imposes. Fourth, the creation of an overly complex and hermetic language designed not to clarify, but to obfuscate and establish an intellectual hierarchy. The antidote to this inflation is what Jung called the earth function. It is the practice of humility, manual labor, caring for mundane tasks, and connecting with people who do not care about your great revelations. It is constantly remembering that, despite all transcendental experiences, you still have to wash the dishes, pay the bills, and deal with the frustrations of daily life. The true spiritual journey is not an escape into the heavens, but a deep incarnation into the earth of human existence, with all its beauty, pain, and contradiction. The true sage knows that he is, above all, an eternal learner. In popular culture, wisdom is portrayed as a prize, a state of serene happiness and power. The psychological reality is much darker and more complex. Every step towards consciousness requires a sacrifice. The knowledge of the truth, especially about human nature and one's own shadow, comes at an exorbitant cost: the loss of innocence and the loneliness of the misfit. The figure of the wise old woman or the prophetess Cassandra, cursed to see the future but never be believed, embodies this sacrifice. By integrating her knowledge, she begins to see the hidden dynamics, the unconscious projections, the power games, and the self-deceptions that govern human interactions. She sees the mask and, behind it, the frightened face. She hears the words and, beneath them, the silent scream of the soul. This sharp perception prevents her from participating in collective dramas in the same way. Trivial conversations become unbearable. The certainties of others seem like fragile houses of cards, and the normalcy of society reveals itself as a form of consensual madness. This generates a profound loneliness. She becomes a stranger in her own culture, a silent observer at a banquet of illusions. The sacrifice is also personal. To know the truth about herself, she had to abandon her most cherished idealizations. She had to face her own envy, her anger, her capacity for cruelty, her shadow. This process is painful and humbling. She trades the comfort of an idealized self-image for the painful integrity of her totality. It is the sacrifice of Odin, who hung himself from the world tree and offered one of his eyes in exchange for the knowledge of the runes. He traded the superficial view of the world with 2 eyes for the deep vision of reality. With 1 eye, wisdom costs us a piece of ourselves, the part that was attached to simplicity and illusion. Finally, there is the burden of knowledge. To see avoidable suffering, the traps people insist on falling into, and to know that you cannot interfere, for every soul has its own journey and its own lessons, is a subtle form of agony. Wisdom imposes the difficult discipline of silence and non-intervention. The true sage is not one who gives advice, but one whose silent presence allows another to find their own answers. It is a path of deep love, but also of deep renunciation. Synchronicity is perhaps the most misunderstood and, at the same time, the most experiential concept in Jungian psychology. It is not mere coincidence. It is a principle of a causal connection, a meaningful coincidence where an event in the inner world, a dream, a thought, an emotion inexplicably aligns with an event in the outer world, with an intensity that shakes our notions of cause and effect. It is thinking of a friend you haven't seen in years, and 5 minutes later, they call you. It is being at a crossroads in life, asking the universe for a sign, and the next day, finding a book with the exact title of your question. To the rational mind, this is just confirmation bias or statistical randomness. To the psyche, It is the language of the self manifesting in the world. The old sage operates through synchronicity. He is the master weaver who aligns the threads of destiny and psyche. These events are the traffic signs on the journey of individuation. They confirm that you are on the right path, warn of dangers, or present unexpected opportunities that the ego could never have planned. Synchronicity forces us to recognize that we are not the sole authors of our story. There is a greater intelligence at play, an unused mundus unified world where matter and psyche are not separate, but are two faces of the same reality. To live in tune with the flow of synchronicity requires a radical shift in attitude. It requires exchanging control for trust, frantic action for active waiting, and linear logic for the perception of the hidden pattern. It is being attentive to the chances of daily life, treating them not as noise but as potential messages. It requires a state of openness and curiosity, a willingness to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. The ego plans, calculates, and tries to force results. The inner sage, on the other hand, knows that the most crucial moments in life are not conquered, but received. They are gifts of grace, moments when the web of the universe reveals itself for an instant, reminding us that we are part of a mystery far greater than our small conscious mind can comprehend. Synchronicity is the experiential proof that we are not alone and that our inner journey has an echo and a resonance in the cosmos. The climax of the journey guided by the sage is not the elimination of darkness, but its integration. This is the great secret of psychological alchemy. The search is not for pure gold, but for the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, which is born from the union of opposites coniunctio oppositorum. Western society has trained us for a morality of division, good versus evil, light versus shadow, spirit versus matter. We are taught to repress, deny, or project onto others the parts of ourselves that we consider bad or unacceptable. The result is a fragmented psyche at war with itself. The sage teaches us that wholeness is not perfection, but completeness. True strength comes not from being good, but from being whole. This means voluntarily descending into the basement of our psyche and confronting the monsters we have imprisoned there, our rage, our greed, our envy, our lust. The task is not to kill them, but to listen to them. What is this rage trying to protect? What is the hunger behind this greed? Every inner demon guards a treasure, a vital energy that was repressed along with it. To integrate the shadow means to acknowledge and take responsibility for the full spectrum of our humanity. It is the moment when the individual can say, yes, I have the capacity to be cruel, but I choose not to be. Yes, I feel envy, and I use that energy to understand what my soul truly desires. This integration is the true source of wisdom. Wisdom is not abstract, bookish knowledge. It is knowledge forged in the fire of experience, tempered by the acceptance of one's own fallibility. The sage is not one who never makes mistakes, but one who has learned to extract gold from his errors. He is no longer fragile, for he does not fear being unmasked. He already knows and accepts his own darkness. This union of the light of consciousness with the darkness of lived experience is the philosopher's stone. It does not turn literal metal into gold, but it transforms the neurotic suffering of a divided psyche into the clean, meaningful pain of an authentic life. It is the end of the internal civil war and the beginning of a peaceful sovereignty over one's own inner kingdom. The sage archetype transcends cultural definitions of gender. Although we often represent it as a wise old man Senex or a wise old woman Sophia, its essence is androgynous, containing and unifying masculine and feminine energies. The journey to wisdom is, in large part, the process of integrating our inner sexual counterpart, the anima, the inner feminine in a man, and the animus, the inner masculine in a woman. A man who represses his anima, his emotions, his intuition, his capacity to relate, and his connection to nature can become a tyrant sage, a dry and authoritarian intellectual whose logic is devoid of heart. For him, the journey to wisdom involves the courage to feel, to be vulnerable, to connect with beauty, and to listen to the subtle voice of his soul. He needs to learn to balance logos, discriminating reason, with eros, the principle of connection. Conversely, a woman whose animus is unconscious may become a passive victim of others' opinions or, in its shadow form, an aggressive debater, possessed by a rigid and impersonal logic. Her journey involves developing her inner logos, clarity of thought, the courage to stand by her own convictions, and the ability to transform her creative visions into reality in the world. She needs to learn to give structure and direction to her relational and intuitive power. The integrated sage is one who has achieved this inner union. He possesses the clarity and discernment of the archetypal masculine, combined with the compassion, intuition, and relational wisdom of the archetypal feminine. He is neither hard nor soft. He is firm and flexible. He knows when to act decisively and when to simply be, when to speak and when to listen, when to lead and when to serve. The psychic androgyny is the mark of psychological maturity. The individual is no longer at the mercy of animus projections in relationships, seeking in the other the part he lacks in himself. He has found wholeness within, which allows him to love another not out of necessity, but out of free choice. He becomes a complete human being, capable of expressing the full potential of the psyche, free from the limitations of society's gender boxes. True wisdom is, in its essence, the celebration of the inner sacred marriage. In a culture that denies death and idolizes eternal youth, the archetype of the old sage serves as an essential reminder of the sacredness of the complete life cycle. It represents the final stage, the autumn of existence, where the task is no longer to accumulate, conquer, or expand, but to consolidate, simplify, and let go. The sage teaches us the art of aging with grace and dying with consciousness. The proximity of death acts as an existential filter. Trivial concerns, egoic offenses, social ambitions, all of this dissolves into insignificance in the face of finitude. What remains is the essential. The sage detaches from what he has to focus on what he is. His journey turns inward, toward the final reconciliation with his history, toward forgiveness of himself and others, and toward contemplation of the mystery that awaits him. The integration of this archetype fundamentally transforms our relationship with death. The paralyzing fear of annihilation gives way to a serene acceptance of the natural process. Jung suggested that just as the morning sun rises with a purpose and the midday sun shines in its fullness, the afternoon sun also has its purpose, to illuminate itself and prepare for sunset. The second half of life is a preparation for death, not in a morbid way, but as the final and culminating act of individuation. The legacy of the sage is not necessarily in great works or monuments, but in the legacy of silence. It is the quality of his presence, the peace he radiates, the wisdom contained not in what he says, but in what he no longer needs to say. His silence is fertile, a space where others can find themselves. He becomes an ancestor in life, a bridge between generations, guarding the memory of the past and blessing the future, without clinging to either. He teaches that death is not a failure, but the natural completion of a work of art, life itself. By making peace with the end, he teaches us to live more fully in the now, for each moment becomes infinitely precious when we know it will not last forever. He shows us that true immortality is not living forever, but living a life so authentic and complete that death becomes simply the last door to walk through. The entire journey, from the first call in the desert of the soul to the acceptance of the end, converges on a single point of transformation, the internalization of the guide. The ultimate goal of the sage archetype is not to create followers, but to awaken masters. There comes a moment when continuing to project wisdom onto external figures, gurus, therapists, books, belief systems becomes an obstacle to growth, a subtle way of avoiding the final responsibility for one's own life. The final call is for psychic sovereignty. It is the moment when you withdraw your projections, thank all the external guides who helped you along the way, and take the throne of your inner kingdom. This is not an act of arrogance as an ego inflation, but of profound humility and responsibility. It means there is no one left to blame, no one to turn to for easy answers. The compass is now firmly in your hands. To become your own sage is to trust your lived experience as the primary source of truth. It is to validate your own intuition, even when it contradicts conventional wisdom. It is to develop an inner dialogue so strong and clear that external validation becomes a pleasant bonus, but no longer a necessity. It is the ability to self-soothe in anxiety, to find clarity in confusion, and to forgive yourself in failure. This inner sage is not omniscient. He does not have all the answers. His wisdom lies in knowing how to ask the right questions, how to endure mystery, and how to trust that when action is needed, clarity will emerge. He is the silent center of the hurricane, the point of stillness that remains stable while the world spins in chaos. This is true power, not power over others, but the power that emanates from a unified and centered psyche. The journey that began with the desperate search for a master ends with the discovery that the master was always at home, patiently waiting to be recognized. The final call, therefore, is an invitation to stop searching and start being, to be the guide, to be the wisdom, to be the answer you so desperately sought.